Okay. Boy, reminder, now, the final exam is next week. I really worked hard on it yesterday. Again, I didn't wait till next week to start on it. I started on it back early in April, early this month. But I finished it up yesterday. I started printing it. But if my printer was old, so I had to print it high quality print in order for you to be able to read it. So it's awfully slow. But anyway, I've got some of it made up. 100 multiple choice questions with a few matching. You will need a Scantron. So and now there will be a test that will begin today at 11 o'clock. All right, so I've got to hurry through these next two chapters. What I'm going to try to do is just cover the high points of the next two chapters, chapters 30 and 31. Starting with Richard Nixon. Well, the book opens up with Phyllis Schlafly. Yes, she will be, her name will appear on your test. Essentially, she was a very conservative woman who was concerned about communism and continued to work for a cause, and finally lived long enough to see Ronald Reagan elected president in 1980. She did not like Jimmy Carter. But she worked hard for Barry Goldwater, and he lost. Now, Nixon. Nixon embraced most of Johnson's Great Society. There were a few things that he eliminated. He eliminated community action that I told you I volunteered for one time. But he eliminated a few of Johnson's more pork barrel, they call it pork barrel legislation. He increased privileges for minorities and women. But nevertheless, in spite of these moves to the left, he actually was, his administration represented a move to the right. He criticized Earl Warren as Earl Warren was a Chief Justice of the United States at the time, who made decisions that gave breaks to criminals, and who made decisions that outlawed Bible reading and prayer in public schools, and generally tried to move America toward the left. They call these people activist judges, judges who legislate from the bench, and their decisions are very, very difficult to overturn. In fact, almost impossible. The Supreme Court at the time under Earl Warren also legalized abortion in the Roe v. Wade. All right, I think I mentioned that. The original Roe v. Wade decision, as I understand it, was only meant to apply to the first trimester of pregnancy. Well, where it has led to, and again, it's like you open a Pandora's box, it's led to more recently where that you actually are allowed to kill your baby after it's born in some places. This was something that just started this year. And most of you, I think, know what I'm talking about. But that was not the original Roe v. Wade decision. They only applied like to the first trimester, the first 3 months of pregnancy, and did not really apply after that. But then it became. Here's the problem: in the first 3 months of pregnancy, a lot of women don't even know they're pregnant. And of course, this bill that has been signed by the governor of Georgia and several other southern governors, and the governor of Indiana also, that says when you detect a heartbeat, by the time you can detect a heartbeat, you're past your first trimester. And a lot of women don't even know they're pregnant until past the time they can detect a heartbeat. So basically what these bills do is, for all practical purposes, they're outlawing abortion. You already know what I think about that without me going into more detail. Eventually, though, Nixon was able to replace Warren with a judge who was more conservative. Warren retired. There was a strong move to impeach Earl Warren, but I think there's only been one Supreme Court justice impeached one time. And I had a student do a paper on it, and they said there was one Supreme Court justice who was known to be suffering from Alzheimer's, but he stayed on a bench till the day he died. Yeah, and actually known to be, and the judges would get together and make up their mind that his decision, if there was a 5-4 case, his decision would not be the one that decided the issue. But nevertheless, These judges get on and they're difficult to remove and difficult to get out.
How is
All right.
that though? How is that? I mean, like,
What's that?
why is it so difficult to remove these judges, man, when there's a clear issue?
They have to, you have to get 2/3 of the Senate. And that has been proven to be really, really hard to do. Really hard to do. Get 2/3 of the Senate to approve of it. Not to mention the House has to bring the charges for impeachment. And then you have to get the Senate to.
But that's on every level of judges, man. I know Raleigh, I used to have to deal with judges like in the magistrate court. And I had this one judge who we had to sign for a warrant. He had to electronically sign.
Yeah.
It's impossible to write your name upside down, clearly. But he refused to let you come around to his side of the desk. So you had to sign your name upside down. And if it wasn't clear enough for him, he would give you the riot act right in his office.
They can make I'm telling you this, the judges can make any decision. They once overturned a constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment. I've told you that. The fifth that gave blacks the right to vote, former slave right, the judges said it was okay to have literacy tests and poll taxes that would keep blacks from voting. They overturned an amendment one time. They can make any decision they want to without any regard to law or the Constitution
At all.
at all. They can.
And then
Yes.
threaten to throw you in jail. And you're there to get a warrant for somebody that's in jail.
Yeah, they can.
So, yeah.
And again, that was not the way the original Constitution was set up. They have usurped that power, and like I said, I believe last class, I had a liberal student tell me one time that it's going to take a president who's going to stand up to them one day and say, enough. We can't put up with this tyranny anymore. But until that time comes, we're going to have to put up with their tyranny. Now, oh yes, I know what's going on. Bear with me, folks. Now, Richard Nixon won the 1972 election by a landslide. He ran against McGovern. Don't worry about McGovern's name, but McGovern picked a running mate who was found to have suffered from depression and mental problems and undergone shock treatments. And so McGovern got rid of his running mate and picked another one, but by that time McGovern was ruined. McGovern was against all wars. He also said, I'm going to give everybody $1,000 by taking that from the rich. Back in 1972, most of us knew better. He actually said that, oh yes. He was going to give everybody $1,000 by taking the money from the rich and giving it, redistributing among the poor. He only carried the state of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Otherwise, he was soundly defeated. But Nixon did not enjoy his victory. Because right away after Nixon, Nixon was at the height of his power, because right about the time Nixon was re-elected, the Vietnam War ended. Richard Nixon was re-elected in January. We were told the Vietnam War was going to end in December. In January, our POWs came home, and Richard Nixon was at the height of his power.
Prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Now, POW.
What's that?
Like one pal, like the prisoners of war.
The POWs, not all of them were released. A bunch of them are still missing to this day.
Yeah. They had like these bracelets that were to show that they were in that time or whatever.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, about this time too, our space program got a big kick. Our space program had a setback in January of '67 when 3 of our Apollo 1 astronauts were killed in a fire. Their names are Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Don't worry about their name, but they were killed in a fire. But in 1968, right after Nixon was elected, into Christmas time, we first orbited the moon. We sent 3 Apollo astronauts into orbit around the moon. It was the first time it was considered a real big feat, and it was something the Russians had not done. But we got 3 of our astronauts around, and those 3 astronauts made Matt and Murray O'Hare really angry by reading from the Bible. They read from Genesis while they were in orbit. Borman, Lovell, and Anders were their names. And don't worry about your names. I know them because I was keeping up with that pretty well. Also, Borman, when he was coming around the back side of the moon, he uttered, "There is a Santa Claus," out loud. All right, now, folks, I want to tell you something now. just 2 days ago, the Navy and Air Force said that they're going to change their policy on having pilots report UFOs. A pilot can now report a UFO sighting without worrying about having his career ended. This is, I mean, check this out on MSN. It's actually, and I checked it, I double checked it myself on MSN and on Fox. And they actually, because there have been so many, a lot of people believe that what Borman saw in Level 1 and Those 2 was a UFO, and the word Santa Claus is a code name for UFO. It was Christmas time now. No, really, it was Christmas time, the Christmas season. But Borman uttered the big words, there is a Santa Claus. But in those days, hush, hush, we don't talk about that. Oh yes, well, they're now saying we can. Well, Richard Nixon, to make a long story short, was forced to resign. Gerald Ford became president. Now, Gerald Ford, Agnew was Nixon's first vice president. But while Nixon was fighting Watergate, all of a sudden we heard that Agnew had been caught taking kickbacks. So as governor of Maryland, and this is how they proved on Agnew, he would give contracts to businessmen, and in turn these bidders would pay him. See, he was supposed to give the contracts to the lowest bidder.
So what was his first name again?
Spiro, like the Spiro of 76, Spirit of 76. See, Agnew was supposed to be the president come 1976. He was called the Spiro of 76, but he never got to be president. Agnew, unlike Nixon, Agnew had to resign quickly. The word came out in August. I was on my way to work when I first heard the news that Agnew had been caught taking kickbacks, and the prosecutor said they had the case all sewed up. Well, Agnew worked out a deal to where he'd resign from the vice presidency. He would not go to jail. Actually, I think he was punished enough. I mean, just having to resign and getting his name tarnished forever. But he resigned. He did not, and he pled guilty to a lesser charge. And I forget what the lesser, but basically he pled guilty to a lesser charge and no contest to the big charge. And you know, if you never know anything about legal, no contest is not necessarily a guilty plea. It's just where the evidence is so stacked against you that you can't fight the evidence, so you just plead no contest. Even though everybody knows if you plead no contest, you're obviously guilty. But nevertheless, officially, no contest is not a guilty plea. So he pled no contest to a big charge, guilty to a lesser charge, resigned from the vice presidency. So Nixon then picked Gerald Ford to be vice president. Gerald Ford is the only president in history who never got an electoral vote.
He's never going to live that down.
What's that?
No one's going to let him live that down.
Yeah, well, yes. He actually did get electoral votes when he ran against Carter later, but he lost. But he was as president, he never got an electoral vote. So he was an appointed vice president, not one who was voted for by the people. Nevertheless, Gerald Ford. Now, the only president had named Gerald. You might or might not know, my middle name is Gerald.
John Gerald.
John Gerald, yeah, John Gerald.
JGC.
JG, yeah. Anyway, Gerald Ford became the president, and he only served as president for a couple of years. Now, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, his most famous act was pardoning Nixon. This was a controversial move, but nevertheless, he pardoned Richard Nixon, the man who had made him, ultimately made him president, issued a pardon. And then he tried to fight inflation. Now, inflation. Okay, Richard Nixon, perhaps his biggest act as president, taking us off the gold standard. For many, many years, gold sold at $32 an ounce. Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, which means that your paper money is nothing but paper anymore. You can't get gold to back it up if you want gold. And then immediately inflation took over. Now, inflation. What is inflation? Basically, that's where prices keep going up and up and up and up. Inflation seemed out of control, both under Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Both of them were not able to fight inflation. Now, folk, I can remember looking for a house while Carter was president. And they not only were charging 16% interest on a loan, today you get a home loan for sometimes 2.5%. But they also were giving points. In other words, yeah, you know what points are. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, points was where they couldn't charge more than 20% interest, so they would add what they called points on, which was basically another high. It was interest. It was basically interest, but it was not called interest.
What is it now, about like 3 points now? Or is it one something?
Yeah, you have to pay 3. Now, points is the thing of the past now. You don't pay points. But where you pay not only the 16% interest, but pay points. Sometimes 3 points, 4 points, 5 points. In other words, it really, really upped the cost. And again, a lot of this inflation was due to the fact that Nixon had taken us off the gold standard. The price of gold went from $32 an ounce at one point to $900 an ounce. Now, it seemed like today it's trading at, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. Trading at $400 or $500, $600 an ounce. It varies every day. But the dollar became worth less and less as time went on. When Nixon took us off the gold standard, the minimum wage was $1.25 an hour. Today it changes. I think about $8 an hour. Does anybody know? $8 or so an hour.
$7.25.
What's that?
I think it's $7.25.
7.25. I think it's more than that. But anyway, 7.25 or whatever. Again, I don't keep up with it that closely. Inflation. Jimmy Carter was a liberal socialist. Tried to bring about more welfare, but he at the same time tried to control spending. And folk, he found you can't have a comprehensive welfare program and control spending. The two do not lie down together. He found it difficult. Inflation went out of hand. Jimmy Carter was a one-term president. Oh yeah, the number one thing that got Jimmy Carter in office was Jimmy Carter was an outsider. Political outsider. In other words, he was not part of the Washington scene. He'd been governor of Georgia. But other than that, he was not part of the Washington scene. He'd never been a congressman, a U.S. representative, never been a U.S. senator, never held an office in the nation's capital. So his outsider status, I've talked to some people at one time and said, all we do is, when we go vote, we vote against the incumbent. Whoever the incumbent is, votes him out. I can see the logic to it. Because incumbents that keep getting reelected and reelected and reelected eventually get to where they get out of touch with with most of us. So they get a sense of, hey, I'm empowered. Also, folk, Donald Trump is the first president we have ever had who never was a politician of any kind and who never had served in the army in any way. Now, George Washington was no politician, but he at least served in the army.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump was what our founding fathers really intended, to take a man who had not been a politician and make him into a leader based on the merits of his work outside of politics. Men like Bill Clinton, and I'll call his name, Bill Clinton, who had been nothing but a politician, a career politician. That was not what our founding fathers had in mind. Who had made his whole life in nothing but politics. Again, they wanted a man more like Donald Trump than Jimmy Carter. Now, something else that I must say about Jimmy Carter, folk. Jimmy Carter was the first president we had to say, I'm a born-again Christian. He was a Southern Baptist Bible school teacher, and he still teaches Bible classes in a church there in Plains. And that got a lot of Americans voting for him, believing he'd be a conservative. He got in office and he became more liberal than any president we've had up to that point. Making moves that not even Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy would make. But anyway, he became very liberal, and the Christian right who had elected him in the first place wound up 4 years later voting for a divorced Hollywood movie star, namely Ronald Reagan. Anyway, Jimmy Carter, after 4 years, he was soundly defeated by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's political career, like Nixon's, appeared to have been dead at one point. After Reagan lost the 1976 nomination, Reagan was by this time pretty old.
Ronald Reagan was a movie star?
Was what?
He was a movie star?
Ronald Reagan was a movie star, yes. Oh, yes, he was a movie star. Actually, now, let me tell you something about his movies. He was a star in the 1930s, during the Depression era. And, but his career ended abruptly when they decided that his type of acting was no longer needed in the set, and his career ended abruptly. And also, television came on.
He actually got like the most votes out of like every other state in America,
Yeah.
except for I think Montana or I don't know. Yeah,
Anyway.
they voted for like, someone else who was running against him too.
Yeah. Anyway, he carried almost most of the states when he was elected, but back to his movie career. His wife went on to become more and more of a star as time went on, and eventually they divorced. He became an unemployed actor, so he devoted his time to fighting communism, and then got into politics and became governor of California, ran for president against Gerald Ford and lost.
He's a great
And he
speech
thought
giver.
his career was over.
He's a great speech giver.
He made a great speech in the 1964 election when Goldwater was elected that really put him high up. And in 1967, when I graduated, we thought he might be the president, but he could not at that time unseat Richard Nixon. So he couldn't defeat Nixon, and he couldn't defeat Ford, but then he did defeat George Bush and went on to become the president after the country got tired of the liberalism of Jimmy Carter. Now, one thing that really helped almost save Jimmy Carter was on November 4th, don't worry about it, but anyway, November 4th, 1979. Now, we might wonder, why do I remember that date? Because on November 5th, the day afterwards, I hired at Lockheed for the first time. So that's how come I remember the date so well. But on November 4th, Sunday, the Iranians took a bunch of American hostages and held them hostage for some 400 days. And the country became patriotic and rallied around. And at Lockheed, they bought a huge American flag, the size of that back wall, that hung there till the day I left them 27 years later. And at one time it became quite dusty, so they took it down and cleaned it up the right way. It probably was supposed to be cleaned, but it was hung inside. And it's a symbol of patriotism, and I saw much more patriotism than I had during the Vietnam era. But our country rallied around Jimmy Carter. Yes.
How are flags supposed to be cleaned? Like flags that big, how are they supposed
I honestly don't know. I know they took it down at one point and cleaned it. They might have just used, Lockheed had some huge washing machines because we had a lot of rags. I mean, they had, I don't know how they cleaned it all. But they might have just dry cleaned it too. Dumped it into chemicals, of which Lockheed had plenty of, solvent chemicals, and pulled it out again. A good question. I thought of that, as I said, but I know they took it down at one point and cleaned it. Oh yes, now, as we were going to the moon, folk, and as the first astronauts were landing, I'm talking about, and we're about to celebrate the 50th year of it. I mean, it happened in 1969, this is 2019, 50 years ago in July, I went to the moon. But as our astronauts were landing, something happened. Senator Edward M. Kennedy had an accident in which a young 19-year-old girl drowned. But then we later were told that this girl survived for so long because there was an air bubble at the top of her car where she was breathing from, but Kennedy waited 9 hours before reporting the accident. By that time, she was dead. This happened as we were, and everybody in the country heard about it, and this guaranteed that that Edward M. Kennedy would never become president of the United States. Edward Kennedy went back to his dad. His dad was suffered from a massive stroke and said, "Dad, I promise it was just an accident. It was an accident." His father refused to eat and was dead by November. Jackie Kennedy Onassis tried to feed him. That is John Kennedy's wife. Others tried to get. He would not eat. And like I say, in short order, he had lived long enough to see 3 of his sons dead and the 4th one disgraced. 2 of them killed by assassin's bullets. One of them, the first one, died in a war, and then his last son was disgraced. Now, during that time, during Carter's time in office, a big accident, a nuclear accident occurred at 3 Mile Island.
Nuclear.
3 Mile Island is near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, near the place where I lived when I was a boy. When I was 9 years old, my family moved there for a short time. Not at 3 Mile Island itself, but at Harrisburg. They had a nuclear reactor there, and the nuclear reactor had a meltdown. Nobody was killed. And you used to read signs, more people have died in Ted Kennedy's cars and in all of our nuclear accidents combined. They used to have bumper stickers that said that. Oh, yes. You know, basically, Edward Kennedy was permanently disgraced and never, but his own people would vote for him for Massachusetts senator year in and year out, up until the day he died. I think he died still a senator. But anyway, an accident occurred at 3 Mile Island. It meant nothing to compare with what happened to the Russians now. All right, give you a hint. Our nuclear reactors are put in buildings like this, folk. And if they explode, the building is going to collapse on itself. You see the advantage to that.
Yeah.
That means that the rest of the people will be protected from radiation and from the blast and all that. Well, the Russians did not do this, and they had a big accident in 1986 at Chernobyl. And to this day, Chernobyl is uninhabited, even though people will go in and visit. And wolves and coyotes and whatever have moved back into Chernobyl and taken over, and they survived. So they figured it'd be 600 to 900 years before Chernobyl would be humanly inhabitable. It might be sooner than that. But the people in Chernobyl were told, get out! And they got out without taking anything with them. Their cars are radioactive, or at least they were. They left family photos behind. They just took the clothes they wore and got out and went to anywhere they could go, relatives or whatever, they got out. But anyway, so much for nuclear accidents. Yes?
What happens when a car is radioactive?
Essentially, if you get in it, you're going to become radioactive yourself. It'll give you leukemia, among other diseases. So, you know, it's a dangerous thing. That's why they were told, don't take anything metal with you. You know, if we were to have a nuclear meltdown, I'd have to take off my ring and throw it away. It would become radioactive. You can't have rings. You can't have. Well, this watch does contain some metal. I have to throw it away also. Anything metal becomes radioactive, and you have to toss it. I'd have to throw my belt away and try to hold my pants up as best I could. I mean, that may sound gross, but you know, basic. You get out without taking your car with you. You run.
Right.
All right. And, oh yeah, Carter gave the Panama Canal back to Panamanians. We were supposed to wait till 1999, but the Panamanians wanted it now, and we gave it to them. The Senate approved the treaty. Carter made the treaty with Panama. The Carter president, I mean, every president has a library, including deceased presidents. When I was at UT, the UT campus set up a library for President Andrew Johnson, even though Andrew Johnson had been dead for almost 100 years when I got to UT in 1970. Well, actually, Johnson died, I believe, in 1871. I went to UT in 1971. But they have a Johnson library, and they have a library for Washington, for Adams, both the Adamses. And anyway, the Carter Library is down here in downtown Atlanta. I'd suggest you might try to visit it. He'll talk about the Panama Canal Treaty, the hostage crisis, the high events of his administration, and how he tried to help the poor. All this, all the president's papers are stored there. Now, in 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter. I remember on election day, Carter was told the night before the election, Mr. Carter, we're sorry, the votes are not there, you're going to lose tomorrow's election. And he went to the polls tearfully saying, I tried to keep my campaign promises. Jimmy Carter was notorious for not keeping his campaign promises, folk. Ronald Reagan cut a lot of welfare programs. I'll say this, a girl that I was dating was involved in helping the deaf. Her degree was in teaching the deaf, and Ronald Reagan cut out her program also. And your book says, and this, a lot of the times it was women who were hurt by his cuts. He also set up tax cuts, a big tax cut that favored the rich. This is, I mean, that's in your book, and your book, the authors make it sound like this was a really, really bad thing. I don't think it was so bad. Again, the richer the rich get, the richer I'm going to get, the richer you'll get. Let them get richer still. But he did, he and also the next Republican after him, George Bush, also had, the two Bushes, both of them had tax cuts that favored the rich. Inflation was brought under control and pay increases stopped. Now, by this time, I myself was at Lockheed, and we get a cost of living. My pay, I started out at Lockheed, my first paycheck, I was making $8.01 an hour. That was $16,000 a year. My last teacher's contract had been for $10,000 a year. All right, on a personal note, I got my master's degree in 1975. I'd go to a department store and price the frames, but see, I was only getting paid once a month. We teachers still get paid once a month. The month was so long at the end of the money, that was a common saying among teachers. I couldn't even afford a frame until I started working for this local radio station in Calhoun, WJTH by name. I started moonlighting at WJTH and getting a weekly paycheck of a mere $60 a week, but only then did I finally buy a frame for my degree, which I still have hanging up in my room to this day. Then I went from